So we are looking to this anandamaya kosha as a modification of tamas. And then in the mind of the Vishwa, in the awakened state, it can be experienced on different degrees by the gain or avoidance of our desire, of objects of desire and fear. So we looked into that. So I was kind of elaborating on these different levels of anandamaya kosha, because in deep sleep, all of us, we experience it and we appreciate it greatly. I mean, it's terrible not to have a good night of sleep. So we rely on it for our sanity and mental clarity and freshness of body, mind. So we really need it. So there is Mark still waiting here. Yeah. So we appreciate it, right? And we need it. But it's the bliss we get by running after objects and succeeding in gaining those objects is superior, because it brings us to this experience of temporary satisfaction, short-lived, fleeting moments of happiness, satisfaction that slowly get us really fed up. We want to come to a point to say, enough. I'm sick and tired of temporary happiness. I want to find real, permanent satisfaction or happiness, because it's too much work to run, to try to succeed. And then I have a short-living kind of moment of peace and love and satisfaction before my mind comes with the next desire in my list. I say, okay, now that I got this, I'll say one more desire. It's like these movies that we see of robbers, that they rob something else, and then they keep robbing and getting richer and richer, and then the guy got a vasana for robbing. And every time he gets a satisfaction, and he says, the last one, this is going to be big. We're gonna rob the central bank, and so on. So this is never going to satisfy, because it's short-lived, and it gives room to the next desire, and then the next desire, because the mind is not satisfied. If we do things for the sake of satisfaction, it means to say we are doing things from what? From unsatisfaction, dissatisfaction. It's different from doing things from a platform of satisfaction, like the Karma Yoga does, So the Karma Yoga does things from the space of happiness, gratitude, and contentment. But the samsari, they do things for the sake of getting happiness, getting satisfaction, meaning to say he's coming from a standpoint of unhappiness. Okay? So we have these two ways to experience this. One is by an undifferentiated ocean of tamas in deep sleep. The other is in the awakened state by gaining what I want or avoiding what I do not want. But then there is another way to accomplish this anandamaya kosha, which is by the means of yoga. So yoga, it seems to be something very spiritual and something close to be the ultimate reality. But as we know, yoga is going to produce only a certain state. Howsoever we want to call it, howsoever big and wonderful and vast and transcendental we want to call this mental state. So by the means of yoga, we may resolve the mind without having to run to gain things or avoiding things. But are we really not running? We are not physically running, but we're still running for something. We are trying to work on this subtle level, working on the setup of the mind, in order to establish a predominance of sattva so that I experiencing this beautiful peace and love and satisfaction, which is nothing but reflection of consciousness, reflection of the self on a sattvic mind. A sattvic mind is a satisfied mind. But yet, now I'm going for this anandamaya kosha by the means of yoga, and my mind remains awake, my mind remains alert. I don't fall into sleep, I don't fall into nirvikalpa samadhi, so it's all good. But yet, every time I suspend my efforts in controlling my mind, controlling my mental setup, you understand? And then the gunas modify themselves. My desires and fears, they come back. Why? Because they were never really addressed. In yoga, we don't really address the root cause of our mental disturbance. The root cause of our running to gain, running to avoid things. And then ultimately, I just put all my efforts into doing yoga to control my mind, but still I'm playing in the setup. I'm not really working on my mind by the means of understanding knowledge. I'm working on the setup of my mind, but by trying to control these proportions of my gunas by the way of discipline, of effort, sadhana, okay? It has a value, but yet it does not address the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is not the proportion of the three energies. The fundamental problem is not the setup of my mind, meaning to say more sattva and less rajas and tamas. This is not the fundamental problem. It seems to be. It's close to the fundamental problem. But the fundamental problem is the ignorance in respect to my true nature that projects all these desires and fears and turns my mind into rajas and tamas, you know, with some background of sattva. It produced this mental, you know, powers to project and to conceal and project and conceal and so on, because, you know, I'm still playing with the mindset. I never really worked on the fundamental problem, which is my ignorance. The ignorance regarding what I really am, what everybody is, the nature of everything, okay, my true identity, nature. So only when we come to that level, we are working at the fundament of the bottom, you know, the base of the problem. And then we can develop self-knowledge and then assimilate, integrate, attain this self-knowledge. And then with this self-knowledge, the mental fluctuations may occur. The mind may become more rajasic, more tamasic, but guess what? The Yanni now knows that he is not the anandamaya kosha. We are going around this last few verses discriminating the self from anandamaya kosha. The Yanni knows I'm not my mental condition. I'm not anandamaya kosha. So if the mind has a predominance of rajas, I may experience some mental agitation, but I'm not the condition. The young knows that. And the knowledge is something that's always present, always good, self-knowledge, you understand? So therefore, I don't depend on the condition of my mind. The condition of my mind was a necessary step for me to understand and to extract and to assimilate this knowledge. You understand the subtle difference, Michael? Yeah? How about you, Elizabeth?
I think so.
Good. So therefore, the anandamaya kosha experienced. When I talk about anandamaya, experiential anandamaya kosha, The anandamaya kosha experienced by a mind resolved by the means of jnana knowledge is the most reliable anandamaya kosha. Talk about experiencing anandamaya kosha, because there is an intellectual anandamaya kosha, which Ranji likes to describe as a sense of confidence. You understand? Balance, mental strength, derived of knowledge that nothing is really going to change me here, nothing is going to affect me here, etc., etc. You understand? This is an intellectual kind of anandamaya kosha, but we are talking here about the experiential bliss, priya, moda, and pramoda. So the best way to gain experiential bliss is by resolving the mind by the means of self-knowledge, because you have worked on the mind on its very, very base, the very fundamental problem, which is one's desires and fears, likes and dislikes, vasanas, identification with those beasts that keeps, pushing us around. So once we work through that and we break that identification, and then the mind settles with a predominance of sattva, you understand? Sattva guna. But even if the mind changes, the yani is not a fact, because the yani knows that he's not, it's anandamaya kosha, because she knows that anandamaya kosha is not what the self is. It's not what she is. Huh? It is pleasurable, and it's the result of meritorious deeds. So when it is experienced, reflection of the self in a mind which is resolved somehow, is in peace somehow, it's a good reflector. Okay? In deep sleep, it does not reflect anything. In a waking state, when we are succeeding in the world, it reflects satisfaction. In yoga, it reflects peace and silence and love. And then in jnana, it produces predominance of sattva guna, regardless of activities, interactions with the field or not. So when it is experienced, anyone who has a body enjoys without effort by becoming bliss itself. So every time we experiencing this lovely feeling of peace, love, contentment, satisfaction, which happens, it occurs in the mind that is calm, tranquil, satisfied, meaning to say it's free from mental agitation and mental depression. When it is experienced, it's being experienced due to meritorious deeds, punya karma. Okay, when it is experienced, anyone who has a body enjoys it without effort by becoming bliss itself. So the individual feels like, oh my God, I am this bliss. I am this bliss. Yet this is a wrong conclusion. We need to put that on the table as well. I am not the experience of bliss. I am bliss because I am of the nature of fullness, wholeness, and completion. This is the intellectual bliss, is the bliss, derived from this hard and fast understanding in respect to what I am. I am Sat Chit Ananta. Consciousness, existence, and infinitely limitless. So, sorry. Gee. Come on. Need to go back to the text. Okay. What is the verse? Okay, got it. So the cheats of the intellect generates actions and experience the results. So the intellect, kosha, is the one that generates actions. No? Is the ego who is going to say, yes, let's do it, let's get it, let's avoid it. And it's going to produce an experience because the result of action is always an experience. Pleasurable results are limited and therefore not the self. So why it says that pleasurable results are limited? Because it is limited. It's limit by time, and it's limit in the sense that it's not stable. It's changing. By the time you start feeling happy, you start noticing that the happiness is already fading. It's already going down. Its intensity begins changing. It's enough a single thought like, oh my God, this is so beautiful, that another thought comes in the mind, oh, I wish it will never last. And then it's already affecting my bliss. So it's limited, and it's limited because every action is a limited action, because there is no way a jiva, limited jiva, limit in its skills, in its knowledge, in its potential, and so on. Any jiva, being a limited entity, cannot produce a limitless result. So these pleasurable results are limited by nature. Therefore, all these pleasurable results, which includes bliss, ananda, this experience of the intellect, kosha, cannot be the self. So, in other words, anandamaya kosha is not the self. That's what we are working to somehow the bank or reject this notion that is so common in the world of yoga. When this limited joy is mistaken to be the self, it becomes anandamaya kosha. Now, this is interesting. When this limit joy is mistaken for the self, we call it anandamaya kosha, so the bliss, sheet, the fullness, satisfaction, and so on. But as we know, this experiential state is a limited state. It's limited by time. It requires constant maintenance. It's always changing from a moment to another. And it's the result of limit actions. Therefore, it can only be limit result. No, there's no way it can be the limitless self. The verse begins by describing this limited joy as a mental modification. That is, it's a vrit, it is a sat. Sat in the subtle body is predominantly sattvic, but the verse stresses the tamasic element in this joy sat, which takes us to the causal body. In other words, it's what I was pointing to. The beginning of the verse takes us to the causal body in the state of deep sleep, okay? Total ignorance. Now, that was the reference in the beginning of the verse. Because we know that for any vrit, limit joy is a mental modification, is a thought. A thought can be a very, very satisfying one or a very painful one. But thought in the subtle body is basically sattvic. But in this verse, the beginning of this verse stressed the tamasic element in this anandamaya kosha, which takes us the causal body to the state of deep sleep. Tamas is inert, the dualist reflector of consciousness. So any joy of which it is a constituent must share its qualities. So if the joy of this deep sleep, of this anandamaya kosha, it is based on the dualness of inert tamas, okay? So its qualities must be tamasic. So we are thus put on note that any thought which appears to bring us happiness is at best a dim reflection of our true nature. So it's also pointing, according to this passage here, that any thought, any experiential bliss is as it said here, is at the best a dim reflection of our true nature. But as we were saying before, tamas is inert. It's the dualist reflector of awareness. So the deep sleep is that state. We experience satisfaction, but it is a dull satisfaction. There is no duality because there is no reflection. So what precisely is the nature of this joy that we experience? We are told that it is pervaded by bliss, which is a term used to describe pure awareness, the limitless self. The nature of this joy is often described, especially in this as limitless joy, limitless security and peace. So this joy, we are told that it is pervaded by bliss, which is a term used to describe pure awareness, the limitless self. So the self is pure limitlessness, it's pure bliss. Bliss, we have to understand this translation of bliss. Bliss comes from the word ananta, and ananta, in fact, means fullness, wholeness, and completion. Means to say that which is one without a second. So if there is only I, consciousness, without anything other than consciousness, and then it means to say that there is no border, there is no limit. I am the only game in town. There is only consciousness pervading everything. Understand? So this bliss is a poor translation of the word ananda. I mean, in fact, it said that to be in Sanskrit, the original word is ananta, which means limitlessness. The nature of the self is existence, consciousness, and limitlessness. Okay, so it was later on translated into ananda, and ananda has this experiential connotation, which was further translated as bliss, which is a sort of experiential ecstasy or sense of happiness. Okay, so but the self is of the nature of limitlessness, but the self is not an experiencing entity. Okay, so this term is used to describe the pure self, the pure consciousness, the limitless self. So the self is present in all joys and sorrows we experience in life, including that contained in a thought and attribute to an object. The self is pervading everything. The self is limitless. The self does not experience any ecstasy or bliss. You understand? Why? Because the self cannot experience anything, because the self is one without a second. The nature of the self is existence, consciousness, and limitlessness. And it's not an experiencing entity. Okay? So when we talk in terms of anandamaya kosha, it's an experience that occurs in the intellect of the jiva, the experiencing entity, when one's mind is really resolved somehow, and that reflection of the self in a sattvic mind produce this beautiful sense of fullness, satisfaction, and contentment. So we say that the nature of the self is bliss, and then we say that anandamaya kosha is the most seducing not self. Because when the mind is in that state, we experience this anandamaya kosha, this sense of satisfaction, peace, love, and tranquility. And we take that to be the self. You understand? We take that to be the self. But the self is present limitlessly through all states of mind. That is the true meaning of ananta, limitlessness. It's not an experience. It can be experienced if our mind has a huge predominance of sattva, but it's almost like useless. It's wonderful. I used to say that it's much better than food and sex combined, but the time came that I walked away from that. Why? Because it comes and goes, you know. Again and again, you see, oh my God, you know. Again, my mind modifies, and again, you know, I have to bring my mind to that state, doing my sadhana, developing that peace, you know, that silence or whatever, and then I experience bliss and ecstasy and peace and love. So the self is present through everything. It's present through all states of mind of the jiva, of the seeker of moksha. Therefore, the self is not that state in a specific state called a sattvic state or blissful state or a state of samadhi. No, the self is that which is pervading all minds, regardless of its mental proportions or composition. Okay. So therefore, the self is present in all joy. I have added that now as I was reading, all joys and sorrows, including that contained in a thought and attribute to an object. The discrimination which is urged upon us here is that which distinguishes limitless joy from its reflection in limited objects. So the subtle body of the jiva is itself an object. Okay, we have the body, we have the three bodies, and all the three bodies are objects, okay, in reference to consciousness. So we have these three bodies, we have these three gunas, all of these are objects. Okay, so the discrimination which is urged upon us here is that which distinguishes this limitless joy from its reflection in limited object. The limitless joy, which is not an experiential joy, although in this text it begins, Shankaracharya begins saying that the self is of a nature of a limitless joy. You know, it's a very interesting statement, limitless joy, but as we know, the scriptures again and again, but the self is not an experiencing entity, but its nature is limitless. And if we have something that is absolutely limitless, what it says about our true nature? If there is something that has no limit, it means to say that there is nothing missing. There is nothing that could be more. There is nothing that could be added. There is nothing that could be subtracted because I am limitless. So something that has no limit can only be peace, joy, satisfaction, fullness, wholeness. So this is just associations that we have with these words, you know. We have to associate this word limitless with joy and sorrow with limitation. So we suffer every time we feel limited. And we are limited by what? We are limited by that which we do not have, but we wish we would have. Limitation nada mais é than a self-imposed notion that there is something lacking in my life, something missing in my life. So Jesus' limitation, which is conducive to the sense of sorrow, suffering, dissatisfaction, but something that has no limits, meaning to say there is nothing limiting, there is nothing lacking, there is nothing missing because I pervade everything. I am the only thing, you know, I'm the substratum of everything. So that can only be a symbol of joy, the best possible symbol of satisfaction and joy, peace and relaxation. No? So this is the discrimination that distinguish this limitless nature of the self from the experience of the reflection of the self in limited objects, in limited vritis, limited desires, and so on. This reflect joy is time bound. This reflect joy is time bound, and it occurs in three distinct states. So it's the priya, moda, and pramoda that we already covered. No? It is the pleasure we experience in the proximity of a desirable object. The second is called moda, which is the pleasure we experience when we are about obtaining the desirable object. And the pramoda is the pleasure we experience when we enjoy the desirable object. Let us say, for example, that we pass a bakery shop, blah, blah, blah. This is most probably is an example of Ramji. He has a vasana for cakes and things like that. He always brings this bakery and the chocolate cakes in his example. So we pass by the pastry, we experience more, and then we go back, and then we start contemplating, and then that happiness starts growing, and then we buy it, we put in the bag, and then when we open it home, and then it's total bliss for some people, for some other people, no. Yet this joy cannot be other than the self. Yet this joy cannot be other than the self. We are told that when our good actions produce circumstances in which we experience pleasure, we become joy itself. We become the nature of the self as limitless. So the verse seems to prevent us with a contradiction. Now, to resolve it, we must understand the meaning of ananda. Ananda. In the first verse, we are told that the self is limitless and of the nature of joy. So we need to understand that, because the joy is experienced by the jiva, not by the self. But the self is not an experiencing entity. So there is an apparent contradiction that we need to look into, that we already contemplated, we already kind of unfold a little bit of this. So to resolve it, the verse seems to present us with a contradiction. To resolve it, we must understand the meaning of ananda. In the first verse, we are told that the self is limitless and of the nature of joy. The Sanskrit term is paramananda. Now, limitless and joy are not two different attributes, nor are they attributes at all, for the self cannot be divided and described. They are the nature of the self. Okay, so limitless is not an attribute of the self. So consciousness is not an attribute of the self. Existence is not an attribute of the self. So Sat Chitananda is the very nature of the self, which is different from being qualities, properties, or attributes of what we are. Understand? So this limitlessness is the very nature of what we are. It's not an experience. You understand? It's not an experience. That's why the true anandamaya kosha can only be retained by the means of knowledge, because this understand in respect to my nature allows me to enjoy this intellectual self-knowledge, which is the knowledge regarding my nature as that which has no limits. Therefore, I don't need to run to gain anything or to avoid. So there is nothing really lacking, because my nature is the light.
Hold on.
I'm the power revealing everything. I'm the power in which things are revealed and known. All happens within the scope of my self, existence, consciousness, limitlessness. Does anybody have a question regarding this last passage? Any doubt?
So what you're saying, Arlindo, is self-knowledge allows you to experience anandamaya kosha all the time, even though you're not experiencing it, because you know it. Do you understand?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Is that the case?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that there are two kinds of satisfaction. One is the intellectual satisfaction derived of the certainty of knowledge regarding, doubtless knowledge regarding my nature as limitlessness. You understand? This is a knowledge that produces as a byproduct a satisfaction, a peace. Okay, I know my nature to be that without 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 beginning, middle, and end. I am beginningless and endless. You know, I'm that in which time and space come and go. You understand? So this clear knowledge, this doubtless knowledge, allows the yoni to enjoy this intellectual anandamaya kosha, which is not dependable on the experience of this reflection of consciousness on a sattvic mind. But guess what, Mark? This intellectual anandamaya kosha, this intellectual bliss, or this intellectual understanding, or this intellectual self-knowledge, as a bonus, affects the mind of the yoni in a way that the mind of the yoni produces less and less desires and fears, and develops naturally and gradually more and more an stability of a sattvic proportion. You understand? So distinction is fine, because we want to emphasize that self-knowledge is not an experience. Self-knowledge is made of pure knowledge and knowledge alone. You understand? Certainty of knowledge, doubtless knowledge, the knowledge that I am that limitless Brahman. You understand? So if we have that knowledge, and then I no longer depend on being there, controlling and manipulating my mental state as a mean to indirectly experience satisfaction, you understand? Peace, limitlessness. That's when Ramji comes and say, knowledge is always good. It's always available. When he says knowledge, he means self-knowledge. Whereas experience, is fickle. It comes,
Absolutely.
it's here, but then it changes.
Yeah.
And Mark?
Yeah. So even though it's not an experience, it affects your experience in a very positive way.
Yeah, it is not an experience. And the anandamaya kosha that the yogs experience is not the self. It's just a reflection of the self on a mind resolved by yoga. You understand? So now the knows that I'm not anandamaya kosha. I'm not this reflection. I'm not this experiential bliss. You understand? He knows that because he understood it. Her true nature as consciousness and consciousness alone. But now what happens once this knowledge is clear and it's held, and then the mind of the yoni naturally develops a higher proportion of sattva without sadhana. You understand? Because knowledge is always good, as Ramji likes to say. You understand? Whereas yoga, controlling the mind, it's only as good as I'm holding my sadhana. I'm keeping my effort to control my mind. You understand? The yoni does not do sadhana. I mean, this is one of those things that people have a little difficult time to understand. That the yoni, very rarely you find a yoni that do sadhana. You understand? Sometimes you may find some yonis that are yogis as well, because they have such a huge vasana for sadhana. and then they know who they are. And again, Ramana Maharaj seems to be one of those good examples, you know. He kept doing his samadhi yoga. He had a vasana for that, you know. But later on, I guess that he was still looking. Later on, he was no longer looking for a cave to be in silence, to close his eyes and to go into samadhi. He was just saying, let everybody come. And people would say, no, no, Bhagwan, no, don't. You need to rest. I say, no, I'm not here to rest. Anybody coming to the ashram has to be given free access to talk to me. He was always available. He was not saying much, but he was seeing people again and again. He was not trying to go into samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi anymore. You understand? So very rarely a yani is after controlling the mind or controlling one's experience or experiencing. You know, the yani lives, it just let the mind go and modify as according to one's sanchita and parabhata karma, you know. So, but again, the mind of the yani is more stable. It's not stable to the extent of falling into nirvikalpa samadhi, you understand? But it's stable in the sense that there is a natural dominance of sattva over rajas and tamas. But the rajas and tamas may come up, so on, but you know, there is overall, there is a natural balance of the three gunas. And the gunas are not the focus of the yani. As soon as we experience joy in the intellect lays claim to it, and in the form of the ego, it declares, I am happy. Further, the ego attributes its happiness to the possession of an object or a certain circumstance. Thus, ananda is obscured by a thought, and its limitless nature becomes circumscribed by time. So very nice. So this joy is the very nature of the self. But as soon as the jiva experiences joy, the mind, the intellect immediately say, oh, this is it. No? Like Papaji used to say, this is it. No? So the intellect is going to say, this is it. And it's going to claim to it. The ego is going to declare, oh, I am anandamaya kosha, I am this limitless happiness and joy and peace and love and so on. Further, the ego attributes its happiness to the possession of that experience. That experience is my happiness. I am that experience. You see the flaw in all of these conclusions, you know, these misunderstandings, these conclusions, mistaken conclusions. Thus, ananta, the limitless nature of the self, is obscured by thought. All these thoughts, I am this, I am that. Now I am anandamaya kosha. I am this beautiful experience. Oh God, I finally got there, you know. All those thoughts are there, obscuring the true nature of the illuminer, the light that reveals, illumines and reveals all those vrids, all those thoughts, all those experiences. This light is obscured. Okay, so the ego, the intellect, lays a claim to it and becomes attached to that object of experience and believes that he is the object of experience. Therefore, one's nature is obscured by that misconclusion, and its limitless nature becomes circumscribed by time. So the word ananta, which means limitless, and ananda, which means joy, are often used interchangeably. in the texts of Vedanta, for joy can be described as the negation of all limitation. So we are happy when we feel free from limitation. That's why this, I mentioned that before, this connection between the joy is a good symbol of our nature as limitlessness. Because when we feel that nothing is limiting us, we feel satisfied. So this joy is described as a negation of limitation. Suffering is nothing other than an attempt to find limitless joy in limited objects. So suffering is nothing other than an attempt to find limitless joy in limited objects. So again, the object called anandamaya kosha, the reflection of consciousness, the experiential bliss that occurs in the mind of the meditator, of the yogi, that object, try to find true limitless happiness and joy in that experience is equal to suffering. Suffering is nothing other than an attempt to find limitless joy in one experience, in an object of experience, in a state of mind. It is suffering. Why it is suffering? Because it's going to frustrate the person. The seeker sooner or later is going to get this to that point of frustration. You understand?
Arlindo, could I ask you to
Please.
clarify? And I'm afraid it goes way back to the beginning, if that's
Yeah.
all right. The very first part of the commentary talked about a subtle mental modification of tamas.
Yeah.
And of course, that confused me because I usually think of tamas as dull and not reflective, and therefore how could it reflect joy? Can I just, instead of thinking tamas, is that kind of almost a lakshana for non-apprehension? Just ignorance?
Yeah. So what I understood, those commentaries that most probably comes from Dayananda, is that all reflection of consciousness in the mind of the jiva, regardless of the nature of the vrit, if the vrit is very subtle, very sattvic, and then there is a bliss, but yet all of them are born out of tamas, because there is no vrit without tamas. Although that's what that commentary will say, although all vrits are fundamentally sattvic, yet they do not stand without tamas, because any vrit, any experience is a pale reflection of the true nature of the self as limitlessness. Why?
So
Because it's a result of an action, it's an experience. It's a pale reflection of our true nature as consciousness, you understand? So therefore there is tamas in there. And for sure there is tamas in there as well.
So it's like rajas is sort of resolved, and even sattva to an extent is resolved. The tamas remains, but there's still a subtle vritti that manifests in the presence of ananta. Therefore you get ananda.
Yeah.
Right?
Experience, the point that should be understood is that any experiential bliss is conditioned by tamas.
Okay, thank you.
Conditioned by rajas, and is conditioned by the three gunas, sattva as well. Understand? It's just that the mind becomes more crowded by sattva, but there is tamas there. You see, in the deep sleep, the mind is totally tamasic. And then in the waking state, there is this fluctuation of proportions, But tamas is always in there. And then what Dayananda was trying to say is that whatsoever bliss we experience, it's just born out of tamas. It's born out of ignorance. Tamas is that which conceals our true nature and makes us believe that my fullness is an object of experience. Understand? That I am this state called anandamaya kosha. This is born out of tamas, the concealing power. You understand? So even the most beautiful experiential moments of bliss is conditioned by tamas, because it is a misapprehension of our true nature that somehow produce, this mistaken apprehension as I am this anandamaya kosha, and I am the not self. Anandamaya kosha, we have to remember, is also the not self, right? So it is.
So all these koshas are just a series of mistakes of
Yeah.
identification.
Yeah, this, we analyzing more in details the not self, so
Right.
that we avoid identifying with any and all objects of experience,
So
including.
it's like, sorry, I usually think about the three bodies as matter, inert matter. And these koshas seem more like functions going on that have their concomitant identifications.
Yeah. So
So
the physical body is the first kosha. It's made out of food, and it's very easy for us to understand that it's not really the self. But yet it's not that easy to disidentify from the self as myself. But we have more of a base to understand. And then when we go to the pranas, and then it's a little denser. It's subtler than the physical body, but it's still yet it's it's still dense enough that we can see that I'm not the vital air. I'm not my physiological functions and so on. And then when we go to our emotions, our thoughts, it's the level of identification is a little bit more hidden, more it's a little bit tougher to disidentify from my thoughts and emotions. Understand? And then when we go to the intellect, we run into some other problems. How am I going to disidentify from my very intellectual knowledge, understanding, my discriminating power, my ideas, my knowledge, you understand? So we have to go, each one of these koshas, Vijnanamaya koshas, we have been covering it lately, and we have been proving by logic that the self is not that the intellect is an object, it's an agent by which, is the ego by which the consciousness of the self operates with, using the power of Maya. It becomes an entity and so on. So now we have been looking into the anandamaya kosha, which is the experience of bliss or the causal body. Yeah, it's associated to the causal body, which is very, very subtle. It's almost impossible to define the causal body. And but yet the scripture, they do a good job in unfolding the logic that proves that the self, that which we are, is not that wonderful experience of deep sleep or bliss or satisfaction or love or peace. And we know that all of those things cannot be us. Why? I mean, it's so easy to discard all of those as myself. Why? Because they appear to me. So if anything that appears to me is an object of experience, I am the knower. And I'm not the intellect. I'm not the thoughts. I am the lights, that illumines the intellect, and then the intellect through certain vrits is going to do what it's designed to do, to become the knower and the experiencer. So we are doing all this work to make sure that we understand that we are none of these experiences. You know, the kosha is just a way to classify different levels of our experiences. You know, so that we begin breaking identification with this experience. I, the food body, I, my physiological systems, you know, my vital air, my pranas and so on, and I, my emotions, I, my thoughts, I, my intellect, and I, my beautiful states of bliss, ecstasy, and satisfaction, you know. So all of these are objects of experience, and we need to understand that we are the light that reveals, in which all of these objects are revealed. The whole
Thanks.
the
Very
whole
clear.
the whole process here is somehow to discriminate as the self from our human experiences. You know, the self operating through the jiva falls into this apparent falls into this amnesia, you know, and forgets that I am limitless, and then identifies with the body and the mind, and with all experience coming through the body and the mind. So we keep discriminating our true nature from all experiences. That's basically what it is. Okay. Suffering is nothing other than an attempt to find limitless joy in limited objects. All of the great lyric poetry of the West is a lament on the fleeting nature of joy we experience through objects, and an expression of a profound desire for lasting happiness. Who is not really hoping and working for lasting joy and happiness? I mean, it comes to a point that we get so tired of having this temporary, fleeting moments of happiness. You know? So there is so much poetry around this perfect, beautiful love that would last forever and so on. And find my soulmate and live forever happy and so on. So the same desire for lasting joy drives people to all kinds of religions, because religions promise what? Religions promise eternal happiness somewhere in heaven. You understand? Yes, come to us. We know that you are tired of running about for little bits and pieces of happiness here. So the real deal is in heaven. And come to us, that we're going to give you the ticket for eternal, everlasting happiness after life. So if we analyze what occurs when we experience happiness, we will realize that the fulfillment of desire, that is the attainment of the object, is the same as the absence of desire. So we already covered that. Joy is not wanting anything. Joy is not wanting anything. Satisfaction is just to be satisfied with what we have, what we are. And we are the self. The self does not want anything, because the self is complete. The 5 sheets we have been considering arise from the desire to feel complete. Ignorance conceals the self, tamas, then goes looking for it, rajas, where it is not, in the world of objects of experience. At those moments when we experience joy, we are in reality tasting the joy of our nature, when the mind somehow is not obscuring our true nature, and somehow we can have a pale feeling sensation of our nature as that which is not lacking anything, limitless, which is our nature. But we attribute that joy to whatsoever is coincidental to it, you know? So I find something, I get happiness in association with a new person, and then by coincidence, I'm satisfied. So I'm going to project it into the person or into that object. And I say, okay, the joy, the happiness coming from that object. So we attribute that happiness in the object to it in the phenomenal world. Thus, the joy that is our nature is misidentified as it contained in the object of experience. So our lives turn into a mad chase after this reflected joy, the joys, the indirect joys that we gain as we project value in the objects, and as we gain the objects, all our subjective madness creation, we project joy and happiness in the object. The objects are value neutral. We say, now this has a value to me because of my vasana, so therefore I go and I'm going to chase it. So our lives turn into a mad chase after reflect joy. We are in effect chasing our own shadow. Nice. We are running out of shadows. The shadow of our limitless nature. Okay, it was a strange class today. I'm happy that at least the three of you have survived it, but not many people showed up to begin with. And I hope you have enjoyed. I did. And I'm gonna put it up in two pieces, the first part 1 and part 2. And we meet again next Thursday. So I'll be in the apartment in São Paulo. We have a good setup there and a good internet. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, everybody. We meet again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arlindo.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arlindo.
Much love.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
You too.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye now.